Here this evening, just make sure that you note it down there. My name's Ann McQuarrie, by the way. I'm a member of the committee that organizes the Sierra Nevada Forums, and Marty and Nancy, raise your hands. We have two other members here. So yes, we have a good time doing it. Tonight, we're going to learn about the Reptiles of Nevada from a couple of people from the Nevada Department of Wildlife. Our main presenter is Jessica Heitt, who's a wildlife educator with NDOW. She's born and raised in Nevada, Elko, right?
Yes.
Yeah. UNR grad with a degree in biology, duh. What else when you're doing this? She began with the Nevada Department of Wildlife working on endangered fish species recovery projects, and currently has held the position of wildlife education for 4 years. She shares her passion for nature and the outdoors by educating the surrounding communities on living with wildlife. I asked her what's her favorite Nevada wildlife species, and she said the raccoon. She's here with Jessica Wolf, who is an urban wildlife educator. What's your favorite wildlife species, Jessica Wolf? Put you on the spot.
Oh gosh, there are so many. Probably the beaver.
Okay, we got the mammals covered.
Yeah.
Okay, without any further ado, here's Jessica.
Perfect. Thank you. Oh, sure, that's fine. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate it. So let's just go ahead and get started. So first, what exactly is a reptile? So reptiles encompass a whole group of animals that are really diverse in size and shape and how they act, but it includes all types of lizards, snakes, alligators, crocodiles, and everything in between. But a couple of the characteristics that make up a reptile is they are always ectothermic or cold-blooded, so they do not regulate their body temperatures like a human or like other mammals do. So in order to warm themselves up, they have to physically move to somewhere warmer, typically in the sun, and then to cool down, they have to find somewhere in the shade. They are all covered in scales of one way or another, and in some form or another also produce eggs. So this includes all types of things, such as the chameleon and so many different types of snakes, so there's really a lot of diversity in the reptile world. So here in Nevada, we have over 100 different species of reptiles in the state. And the reptiles that we have in Nevada, for the most part, are really well adapted to living in the desert. So for that reason, we have a lot more diversity in southern Nevada. Just because of the warmer climate, it allows for a lot more reptiles to survive there. So here's just a couple of cool ones that we won't get to tonight. Most of the ones I wanted to focus on tonight, you will find in northern Nevada, with just a few other ones sprinkled in because they're cool. So throughout the presentation, I will be using the word venomous a lot. So I wanted to quickly just talk about the difference between venomous and poisonous. They are words that are typically used interchangeably, but they are a little bit different. So venom in animals, it has to be injected in order for it to cause any harm. So it has some sort of injection method, whether that be fangs or stingers. So things that have venom are snakes, jellyfish, stingrays, something that stings or injects you with venom in one way or another. Versus poison needs to be absorbed in order for it to be harmful to you. So you have to eat it, touch it, absorb it through your skin, something like that. So that's going to be poison ivy, poison hemlock, poison dart frogs. So don't go around licking them and you're typically fine. So I thought we would first start off with the desert tortoise, which is the state reptile of Nevada. And they can get pretty big. So naturally, we only have them that live in the Mojave Desert in southern Nevada. You might find a desert tortoise in the northern part of the state, but if you do, that means that it's actually somebody's pet who got out, because there are tortoise adoption programs. So you can have a desert tortoise as a pet if you meet all of the right qualifications and whatnot. So if you find one up here, it's definitely somebody's pet who got out, so you should call the tortoise group and they will try to find its home. But naturally, they do live in southern Nevada, and they can get pretty big. So they can get upwards of 15 pounds and about 2 feet long. And they are extremely long-lived. So 50 to 80 years, and that's in the wild. So in captivity, they often outlive their owners. And tortoises get passed down for a couple of generations. So if you grow up with a tortoise, it's pretty good chance you're going to inherit it one day. Their diet consists of all types of desert plants, whatever plant matter that they can find in the area. They'll eat cacti, flowers, grasses, and they really absorb a lot of the water that's out of those plants as well. Some of the neat adaptations that desert tortoises have is their legs are cool because they are literally like little elephant legs. They are the same type of skin, super strong, just little stout elephant legs. Desert tortoises are not at all like turtles. If you put them in the water, they will sink like a rock. They are very dense. They don't have webbed feet like turtles. They are not made for the water at all. They have really large claws because they're really excellent diggers, and they're super important for desert habitats because they create a lot of shelter for a lot of other animals. So they dig these burrows, one to escape the heat during the desert, in the desert heat, but also they will brumate or hibernate during the winter. So they'll dig down and sleep through the winter when it gets too cold, and they share those burrows with a lot of other reptiles too. So snakes and lizards, it's just going to be a whole reptile party in there during winter that they all kind of hang out in this one burrow together. So tortoises are really important for digging those burrows. They have something called a gular horn, which on that bottom picture in the bottom left-hand corner, it's that protrusion that's coming out underneath their head. So both sexes have this, but it's going to be a lot more pronounced on the males. And the purpose of it is literally to flip each other over. So the males will spar with each other, always trying to gain the affection of a female. And they'll just try to hook that under the other one's shell and basically just flip them over, and then they win. And they have a pretty impressive bladder that can store up to 40% of their body weight. So they can live off of that those water stores that they have in their body for a long time. They only need to drink water, like they can go up to a year without drinking water. Just because they're so well adapted to living in the desert. And whenever it does rain, they always come out of their burrows to drink whatever water is available, and they'll even dig little basins in the sand so that when it rains, it collects in their little basin and gives them more water to be able to drink. And it is true that if you were to pick them up or move them or scare them in any way, that they empty their bladder on you. It's supposed to be a defense mechanism. I don't know how it's super defensive, but other than to frighten whatever animal it is. So they will. It really puts them at a disadvantage when they do that. And their reproduction is pretty interesting as well. So they don't want to reproduce in years when their young aren't going to be successful if there's not enough water. So the females will store sperm for up to 5 years and not fertilize her eggs until it's a high water year and there's going to be enough food for the young to be successful. So moving on to our lizards. The horned lizard, often referred to as a horny toad, is super interesting. So they are covered in these scaly horns. So the horns on their back are just modified scales. But on their head, they do actually have true horns, much like a bighorn sheep, where there is bone that is connected to their skull underneath their horns. So does the horny toad. So you can see that picture on the top right. You can see his little horn protrusions that are coming off of the skull. They get their nickname of horny toad. It's pretty accurate because they're relatively lazy, much like a toad is, and they're kind of toad-shaped as well, a lot flatter and fatter than most other lizards that you would see. So their stomachs, compared to other lizards, are about 65% larger. So that is what gives them that big circular shape. And they have really fantastic camouflage. So that's going to be one of their better defense mechanisms, is that they will kind of sit down in the sand and they'll just like wiggle back and forth and bury themselves in sand, get all settled in it, and kind of just sit and wait and hang out for food. So they're not super active. Their diet consists of all kinds of insects, but they are the only animal that will eat harvester ants. And harvester ants are also venomous. And these are the only animal that can eat them and is immune to their venom. So the ant venom could be very deadly to many other animals. So the ant venom is thought to be one of the most deadly venoms that there is, even though it just comes from a little ant. So it is said that one bite from one of these harvester ants could kill 3 to 4 mice. So it's pretty impressive that these guys are immune to it, and that they are the only animals that will eat them. So they'll just seriously camp out next to a harvester ant hill and just pluck them off one at a time with that toad-like tongue. So they do the same thing and they stick out their tongue like toads with their sticky tongue and just pluck off the ants one at a time. And then they have that giant stomach to be able to fit a whole lot of them. So they really gorge themselves on these ants when they're there. Some of the super fun adaptations that horned lizards have is, first, if they're feeling threatened, they can puff up to almost 2 times their size. So that's the picture in the top right. Another reason why they get the toad nickname is because they can get so big and round like a toad. And the whole purpose of that is just to try to look big and spiny and really hard to swallow. They just want to look like, you really don't want to eat me, it's gonna be hard. Is kind of what they're trying to accomplish. If that doesn't work, they kind of do this weird sporadic type sprinting. They don't have very good endurance. They can't run for very long. And so they'll just kind of sprint and stop and sprint and stop and hope that the fact that they don't keep running confuses the predator as well. And then as an absolute last resort, they can shoot blood out of their eyes. So cool. So what they do is they will decrease the blood pressure in their head and redirect all of that blood toward their eyes. And the pressure mounts to the point that one of the blood vessels will burst and they can shoot a stream of blood coming out of their eye. And they can still move the muscles in their eye, so then they can stream of blood towards whatever is coming after them. And it's not necessarily harmful or toxic to the animal in any way, but will definitely throw them off their game. And that's the whole purpose of it, is just to confuse whatever animal into what the heck just happened. And it's pretty successful. So moving on to a type of lizard that's pretty common in the area, and most everyone has probably seen it at some point or another, is the western fence lizard. So they have a lot of color variation. So they can be pretty light colored, like the ones in this picture, to really almost like dark gray, nearly black. But they have the nickname of blue bellies because they have blue on their throat and blue on their bellies as well. And the blue is just typically present on the males. It's super light colored on the females and the juveniles. And they are all throughout this area, and they get preyed on a lot by a lot of different animals, birds and reptiles, domestic dogs, because they're always out, and you can get pretty close to them before you spook them, before they run off. These guys even get eaten by shrews. And if you know what a shrew is, that's pretty sad, because a shrew is like this big. They will eat all types of insects, but what's really fascinating about them is they are one of the lizards that can detach their tails. So not all lizards can do that, but these guys can, and it'll take about 3 to 5 weeks to grow back. They do have, a maximum number of times that they can regrow their tail. So it's not an infinite amount of times. And it's also really hard for them when they lose their tail. It really throws off their balance. They kind of have to learn how to run all over again. So it's pretty difficult for them. So they try not to do that except for in, last resort type circumstances. But the most interesting thing about these guys is they get fed on by ticks a lot. In that bottom picture at his neck, you can actually see a tick on there. And in their blood, they have a protein that when the ticks feed on them, the protein in the lizard blood gets ingested by the tick, and that protein kills the Lyme disease bacteria that's inside of the tick. So they can basically cure Lyme disease. So then they cure that tick of being able to spread Lyme disease until it goes to feed on something else that already has Lyme disease. But we have found that where there are a lot of these western fence lizards, there is an incredibly lower prevalence of Lyme disease. And they don't have these types of lizards on the East Coast, where there is a lot higher prevalence of Lyme disease. So super interesting that that protein in their blood kills the Lyme disease bacteria. The Gila Monster. So this is another one that we do not have in this area, but I included them because they're super fascinating. They are the largest lizard in the United States, and the only venomous lizard in the United States. And they can get up to about 2 feet long. And their scientific name is Heloderma suspectum. And heloderma means studded skin. So it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but they are super bumpy. They've got little ridges all over their body. And you can see it in the skull. So their actual skull has all of these little ridges on it as well. And the suspectum in their name is because the original settlers that identified the Gila monster thought that it might be venomous, but they weren't really sure. And so they suspected that it was venomous. And so that's how they got their name. They have this really bright black and orange marbled pattern. In some of them, it's going to be a little more muted than that, but it's always going to have some shade of orange on them. Their diet consists of all types of eggs, birds, mammals, other lizards as well. And they really will just eat as much as they can whenever they get a meal. So they don't have to eat super often. They only have to eat about 5 to 10 times a year. But when they do eat, they eat a third of their body weight. So they will sit and totally decimate an entire nest of whatever they can find. So some of their adaptations, unlike the horny toad, these guys do have really great endurance. They're not very fast sprinters either, but out of all of the lizards, it is said that these guys can run the furthest for the longest. So it is a marathon for them, not a sprint. They can climb trees, which makes sense because they're trying to eat eggs out of nests for the most part. So they are great climbers. They've got really big claws for doing that. A really great sense of smell as well, so that they can locate their food. And then, like I said, they are venomous. So it is still very painful venom, but there hasn't been a death from Gila monster venom in about 100 years because they're really slow, and as long as you're not picking on them or handling them in any way, it really shouldn't be an issue. They're not fast, they're not jumping out at you like a rattlesnake might. And due to their coloration, so since they are so bright, much like a poison dart frog is, it is thought that their venom is really just meant as a defense mechanism to protect themselves. They're not, injecting venom into anything that they're eating. It's really just to be able to protect themselves. And they don't have fangs like rattlesnakes do, so they don't inject the venom all at once like a rattlesnake would. They have really strong jaws, so they would bite and clamp down, and then they have to massage the venom into whatever it is that they're biting. So it's really a pretty slow process. So moving on to some snakes that we have in the area. So a California Kingsnake. So the one that we have in this area is going to be the top one, the black and white version. In Nevada, there are some of these red ones, the mountain kingsnakes, but they're in pretty isolated mountain ranges, so they're not nearly as widespread. These guys will eat all kinds of rodents, birds, amphibians, anything, but they get their name of the kingsnake because they are the king of all snakes, because they will eat other snakes as well, including rattlesnakes. So these ones are constrictors, so they will just wrap themselves around an animal and constrict and suffocate it, and that's how they eat it. And so since they are doing this to other snakes as well, they have double the constricting power of similar-sized snakes. So if you saw the gopher snake out there, this guy can squeeze twice as hard as our gopher snake out there. And that is an adaptation because if they're eating snakes, snakes don't need as much oxygen as mammals do, so it would be harder to be able to constrict them. So they have the 2 times the squeezing power. I wouldn't suggest trying to handle these, although they are not venomous. They're pretty aggressive because you could be if you are the king of all snakes. And they also have a musk gland, so if they get mad at you, they will kind of spray stinkiness all over you. The rubber boa is a kind of fascinating snake. They are basically unlike any other snake that we have. These guys don't really like the dry desert. They're going to be found much more in riparian areas, at higher elevation, lots of trees. They're going to be nocturnal, whereas most of our other snakes are not. And they basically just look like giant worms. They don't have a lot of really obvious markings. Their scales are super smooth, and they're kind of just shiny. And they have the nickname of the two-headed snake. In that top picture, you can see their tail is kind of just rounded off and looks very similar to their head. There's nothing really identifying their head. Their eyes are super small. You can't really see it. And one of their defense mechanisms is when they feel threatened, they will coil up and then put their tail up in the air to try to trick an animal into thinking that's their head. These guys will eat a lot of eggs. That's going to be their main source of food, so they're great climbers as well for getting to nests of eggs. And when they do it, they will totally decimate a whole entire nest. And so sometimes when you see them, you'll see a lot of scarring on their tail because while they're eating the eggs, they're using their tail to fend off the mother that's trying to get back to her nest. So you'll see bite marks and scratch marks from birds or rodents or whatever nest they've gotten into all over their tail of them defending their food source. So some of the adaptations that they have, they don't have anything super specialized, though they're nocturnal, they are at higher elevations, and they also have a musk vent, but really their best hope is to just try not to be found. So they don't have really obvious markings or anything because they just try to not let anyone know that they're there. Is the best way that they can survive. So moving on to rattlesnakes. So all rattlesnakes belong to the family of pit vipers. So pit refers to a heat sensing organ, so it's the pit organ. And when you see a close-up picture of a snake, that's going to be the little holes on the sides of their face. That's their pit organ. And it basically gives them thermal vision so that they can sense heat around them. The viper refers to them belonging to the family of Viperidae, which also includes water moccasins and copperheads. So a whole family of terrifying snakes. So they have hollow fangs. So their fangs basically act as a hypodermic needle. So unlike the Gila Monster that really has to work to get the venom in, these guys bite you and can inject the venom all at once. So really just like a needle. They are folded flat against their head inside of their mouth when they're not in use, so that they're not poking anything inside of their mouth. And since they are hollow, they break off pretty easily. So behind their active set of fangs, they always have a set of 7 developing fangs ready to come in and replace the ones that are broken. And then connected to those fangs are their venom glands. So that's what gives rattlesnakes their big triangular head, is the fact that they have the venom glands on either side of their face. So one of the best ways to identify a rattlesnake is that they have the vertical shaped pupils. You probably don't want to get that close. But if you get to see our snakes in the lobby, you will definitely see that Hank, the rattlesnake, has these vertical shaped pupils. But they don't really have very good eyesight. So they're really relying on that heat sensing organ more so than their eyesight. They can get, they can see shapes a little bit, but it's not super well defined by any means. They don't have any external ears, but they do have an auditory nerve that they use to sense vibrations. So typically, they can feel us coming before they ever see us or we see them. So they have that for horses, cows, any sort of large animal, deer, elk, so that they can get out of the way before they get trampled. They can smell both through their nostrils, and they also use their tongue. So that's why they're flicking their tongue all the time. They have a special organ called the Jacobson's organ that is a chemoreceptor that they use for smell. So they send their tongue out, and then it brings those chemoreceptors back into their mouth and sends it to the Jacobson's organ. So it gives them a really good idea of what's going on around. That's why they have the forked tongue. It's just more surface area for them to get a better sense of what's going on, and basically allows them to smell in 3D, if that makes sense, to smell two different directions all around them. And then on all rattlesnakes, you will see a rattle, and that is just made of keratin. So each one of the different notches on it is called a button, and they get a new button every single time that they shed. So a lot of people think that you can tell how old a rattlesnake is by how many buttons that they have on their rattle, but that's not true because it's just keratin, the same stuff as our hair and our fingernails, so they break pretty commonly, and then it's just how often they shed. So the faster they grow, the more they eat, the more rattles that they will have, the more rattle buttons. So rattlesnakes give birth to live young. So while they carry eggs, and they carry eggs inside of themselves, they hatch inside of the female, and then she gives birth to live young. And then they come out, and they are fully formed, ready to go rattlesnakes. When they are born, they just get the one button, so you can see the one little rattle button on the little baby rattlesnake. And they aren't able to actually rattle yet because it's the sound that they make by rattling is two of those buttons rubbing together because they're hollow. So that's the actual noise. So they can't quite rattle yet, so they won't be able to until they shed the very first time. And females can produce anywhere from 4 to 20 young, but they have really low survival rates. Lots of things can eat baby rattlesnakes. So only about 20% of them actually survive. And it's often said that baby rattlesnakes are more venomous than their adult counterparts, and that's not necessarily the case. So it's not that their venom is any more toxic in any way, it's just that young ones tend to not have as much control over how much venom they are injecting into something. So if they feel threatened in any way and were to bite, they might empty their whole entire glands, and it just depends on how much time they've had and how much venom they have stored in there. They eat all kinds of mice, rats, small rodents, small birds, and they use their venom for their prey. So that's why they are a lot more camouflaged versus the Gila Monster that's really bright. That's how we know that their venom is defensive versus the rattlesnake venom is to get their prey. So they will inject it into their food, and then they will consume it, typically head first, especially if it's a bird, so that the wings don't get stuck in them. And that's why the horny toad puffs up real big. He's like, "You can't eat me, don't do it." So that's what they're trying to convey. And then after they've eaten, they do need to go to a nice warm place to be able to digest. So oftentimes if you see a rattlesnake out in the middle of the sun and he might be digesting, just back away and leave him alone. There are different types of venom depending on what the animal is. So all venom is just highly modified proteins and enzymes that are in a form of modified saliva. And antivenom can only treat a specific type of venom. So it is kind of important if you're in places with a lot of venomous animals to know what you got bitten by if you were to be bitten, which is very rare. So there's a hemotoxin, which is super painful, and it destroys red blood cells. There is a neurotoxin, which doesn't hurt as bad, but it shuts down your nervous system, which is kind of scary. And then there is the Mojave toxin, which is a combination of both, and only the Mojave green rattlesnake has that. So Nevada has 6 different species of rattlesnakes, but good news, 5 of them live in southern Nevada. So these are the 5 that we do not have in the area. So on the top left is the Mojave green, so they get their name because they do tend to have that slightly greener color. And that is the one with the special type of venom. There is, the middle one is a speckled. The top right is a Panamint. Those used to be one species and they just split. The bottom right is the Western Diamondback, also infamous. And then the bottom left is the Sidewinder, the really cool ones that kind of, they get their name because they move weird and sideways. And this is the type of rattlesnake that we have up here that Hank was out in the lobby. So a Great Basin rattlesnake, also known as a Western rattlesnake. So this is the only venomous snake, or lizard for that matter, that you will find in the northern portion of the state. So if you were to come across a rattlesnake up here, it is this one. They live in all kinds of habitats, so they can, they'll live at the base of the Sierras, they'll live out in the desert, they'll live in junipers, sagebrush, scrubland, so they're pretty adaptable, which has allowed them to cover all of northern Nevada. And then this guy is the gopher snake that we also have out in the lobby. And gopher snakes are pretty amazing because they are really good at imitating rattlesnakes. They have pretty similar coloration and pattern, enough that they can trick not only animals but people as well into thinking that they are rattlesnakes. So totally not venomous. But they will flatten their head, like that picture in the bottom left. You can see that they'll flatten their head and make it look big and triangular, much like the rattlesnake. And then they can also move their tail really quickly in the brush. That makes it sound like a rattle as well. They've done it to me and totally scared me. Totally got me. So some of the ways to tell them apart. So really look at the head. The triangular head versus the slender head, and you can look and see, is he faking a triangular head, or does it look like it's actually supposed to be that way? And then the size of the body. Rattlesnakes tend to be short and thicker, versus gopher snakes are really long and slender. And then a dead giveaway is the presence of rattles, but often you're going to have to use just 1 or 2 of these instead of all of them because, if the animal is coiled, then you can't see their tail. You can't always get close enough to be able to identify all of these, nor would you want to. So a really good close-up look of their head, the really slender head versus the big, fat, triangular head. Like I said earlier, their eyes are slitted. So the rattlesnake eyes have like the slit cat eyes versus the nice round pupils of the gopher snake. And then you can also see really well in this picture the pit organ. So there's the eyes, and then at the very front is the nose, and then the little hole is the pit organ there. So rattlesnakes really don't want to have to strike or use their venom on you. Their venom is really for their food. If they can't eat you, it's really not worth it. So they really have a pretty graded response when it comes to interacting with anything larger than them that they can't eat. It's really energetically expensive to make venom, so again, they don't want to waste it. So if they have that option, if they feel the vibrations, feel you coming, a lot of the times they will hide from us. So they go in rock crevices, they've got really good camouflage. A lot of the times we probably walked by them and had no idea that they were there. Second is they have the rattle for a reason. Again, they don't want to have to use the venom. That's the whole reason they evolved the rattle, is to be able to warn things that they're too close and that you should go away, and then if you don't listen, then I'll bite. So they have that rattle to warn you to stay away. And then third, they will strike as a last resort. So no, they cannot strike twice their body length. It's typically about a third of their body length. And in some places, rattlesnakes are actually evolving the trait not to rattle, which is concerning because humans are basically causing that to happen. So whenever a rattlesnake rattles and then we kill it, that is selecting for rattlesnakes that don't rattle. And so over time, that is selecting for rattlesnakes that either have broken rattles, they don't work for whatever reason, or they choose not to. And so then they're just biting without giving the warning. And that is something that humans have entirely done by killing rattlesnakes just for rattling. So good news with bites that up to half of the bites are actually dry, so meaning that they don't always have venom in them. And for the most part, they occur on hands and arms, and a lot of the time it's people who are intentionally handling the snake, and a lot of the time it happens to be males between the ages of about 18 and 30. So a good way to not get bitten by a rattlesnake is to just not pick on the rattlesnake. Beyond that, you are substantially more likely to be bitten by a dog. And domestic dogs kill on average 30 people per year, and rattlesnakes are about 5. So a lot safer, and that's in the US. What you should do if you get bitten. So just the absolute best thing you can do for you or your dog or whomever may have gotten bitten is just to seek medical attention. Don't do any of the weird things that have been perpetuated over hundreds of years. So don't do a tourniquet. You don't need to cut open the wound and bleed out the venom. You don't need to suck out the venom. Again, remember that those fangs are hypodermic needles. So once it's in, it's in. You can't suck it back out. And you don't need to put ice on it. That is more likely to just cause an infection. So the best thing you can do is clean the area and, as hard as it may sound, remain calm. The more worked up you get about it, the more likely you are to be circulating that venom faster through your body. And just go to get medical attention. If you're in southern Nevada, where there are a lot of different types of snakes, you probably won't think of it, but if you do, try to snap a picture of the snake. It will help the doctor know what kind of snake it is so that they can deliver the correct antivenom. So what you can do to be able to prevent conflicts with these animals is if you're out and about, especially anywhere that you know that there's going to be snakes, just be aware and alert. If you see lizards, snakes are active as well. You might not see them, but they're definitely out there. Be on the lookout and listen for them, and look for places that you think might look like good snake habitat and then avoid them. So they like lots of rocks to hide under, especially if it's hot. They're going to want to be in the shade. Lots of vegetation. Places where rodents would be is probably a good place where snakes are going to be hanging out too. So if there's lots of hiding places, try to avoid that. If you are walking where there's lots of rocks, step on top of the rocks instead of over or next to them, because then if something's underneath it, it would be easier for them to get to your foot or whatever might be there. And stay away from holes in the ground. It could be a snake hole, but it could also be a rodent hole, and then there's a snake hanging out waiting for whatever rodent to come out. And just don't touch snakes, alive or dead. It is true that they can have that bite reaction even after they're dead. So just don't touch snakes of any kind. And how to keep your pets safe. So again, if you're going out somewhere that you know there's going to be snakes of some kind, just know before you go and be prepared for listening for the snakes, looking out for all of those things we just discussed. Avoid tall grass and stick to trails. If there is a super clear defined trail, stay on that area and try to keep your dog on that area instead of venturing off into the shrubs and the tall grasses around. Definitely keep your dog on a 6-foot leash, not only for snakes, but for so many other wild animals as well. It's just best to keep your dog on a 6-foot leash. And teach him the leave it command. This is Whiskey. He's terrible at the leave it command. We're working on it. Signs of a bite. So dogs typically get bit on the face because they're super curious and they've got their nose in everything. And oftentimes you might not even know that there was a snake in there. So look out for signs of a bite. Your dog jumped back, it yelped, there's blood, they have any sort of swelling on the face area. It could possibly be a rattlesnake bite. And to just get them to the vet as soon as you possibly can. There are rattlesnake avoidance training classes for dogs. So Get Rattled is a company that does it. And it works really great from what I've heard, it's incredibly effective. So keeping snakes or rattlesnakes out of your yard, any sort of exclusion would require pretty modified fencing, including burying a portion of wire underground so that they can't get under it. It'll also help keep rodents out and rabbits and things like that. Remove excess shrubs, so anywhere for them to hide. Don't feed birds because that'll knock seed onto the ground, which attracts rodents, which attracts snakes, which could be a good thing if you like gopher snakes, and then they are pest control for you. But if not, I would suggest not feeding birds. But if you have a lot of rodents in your yard, be prepared, you could possibly have snakes as well. But they are really beneficial and super great pest control, typically at an exact cutoff. They're going to be a lot less active and for a shorter period, but there's not an exact cutoff. Any others? Well, everyone should definitely come and take a look at the snakes out in the lobby if you didn't get a chance yet, and both Jess and I will be hanging out there if you think of anything in a few minutes. Thank you so much, everyone.
Again, a reminder, no, we're not doing any presentations this summer, but look for us in September. And I did leave my notebook out on the table just as you go out, so if anybody has any ideas about a future forum, please let us know, and thank you all very much for coming.